Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our April edition of our sustainability webinars. Today, we're continuing on our journey through AASB S2, climate-related disclosures, brand new standard. The first organisations will be reporting against the standard in Australia for 31 December this year. So we're really doing a lot of work to get those organizations and everybody ready. A lot of hard work. So welcome to the session. Now, you will remember that in last month's session, we started with AASB S2 and we looked at the governance pillar. Today, we're moving on to the strategy pillar, and we're going to look at the strategy pillar over 2 months. So in this webinar, in April, we're getting to the end of April, it's part 1, and we're particularly looking at what are climate-related risks and opportunities. And then next month in our May webinar, we look at additional disclosures around the impact, the financial modeling, and the resilience of the business model and value chain. So this is really the first part of a 2-part webinar on strategy. There's so much to unpack today. So my name is Aletta Boshoff. I'm the national leader at BDO for sustainability. And then in a previous life, and still going with that previous life, IFRS and corporate reporting, more than 30 years looking at IFRS accounting standards. Love those accounting standards. BDO acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here. As you know, we've got these monthly sustainability webinars. We're looking at strategy this month. Next month, we move on to the second part of Pillar 2. Then we'll be looking at Pillar 3 for 2 months, and we'll also be looking at Pillar 4, metrics and targets for 3 months. And then we'll wrap it up, bring it all together in the first mandatory sustainability report. Everything we're doing is a focus on getting you assurance ready. We also present these IFRS and corporate reporting webinars, and I want to have a very particular call out for the one in May. In all the years that we've been presenting webinars at BDO, the highest attendance number has always been for the May IFRS and corporate reporting webinar, because it's the one focusing on getting organizations ready for 30 June 2025 or 30 June reporting every year. We look at financial and sustainability reporting and getting you ready for that 30 June reporting season. So please register for that. It's a very important one, well attended, and I think it's very valuable. Then I also want to flag that over the last 18 months, we've been running in-person and virtual carbon accounting masterclasses, because measuring your carbon footprint is so important for actually complying with AASB S2. Going forward, due to popular demand, we will be running quarterly carbon accounting masterclasses. We'll be doing it virtually. So the next one is Wednesday, the 4th of June. There's also one on the 3rd of September and one on the 3rd of December. I'll personally be presenting those. It will be virtual. It's 6 hours, 9 to 5. We have some good breaks so we can stay engaged. And we're improving it a bit more. We're having more case studies, so please register for those. Then I would like to ask you if you could please complete a survey, a very short survey for us. And this survey has been launched by BDO Global, and the survey closes on the 9th of May. So what we would like you to do is please complete the survey. We're trying to get feedback on the priority of sustainability within your organization. Now, why I'm really keen for Australian entities to complete the survey is this survey is going out globally, and it will give us an opportunity to contrast and compare the perception in Australia versus what's happening in Europe, in the US, and other countries. And I think this will give us really valuable information, and obviously you'll get a copy of that report. So if you're willing to complete the survey, we are thinking 10 to 15 minutes. I've actually completed it on behalf of BDO Australia because we're also a Group 1 entity. So it doesn't take that long, but we would really value your feedback. Then if we look at the latest developments, and just a second, I'm really concerned. I've just lost my screen here. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. I wanted to start this session by looking at the very latest developments around AASB S2. And as you know, we always start our webinars with the latest developments. On Monday, 2 days ago, on Monday, the International Sustainability Standards Board published an exposure draft, and they are proposing to make amendments to IFRS S2 to make it easier for companies to apply IFRS S2. And I've got a link there to this exposure draft. Now, this exposure draft will be picked up by the AASB shortly, and they will also propose targeted amendments to AASB S2, which we are talking about. So I wanted to share that with you. An overview of these proposed amendments. First of all, the ISSB have received a lot of market feedback, and therefore they've decided to make these amendments. And they want to provide reliefs to ease the application requirements specifically related to greenhouse gas emissions. So that's in Pillar 4. And it's in a response to feedback that they've received around application challenges. They are not focused on reducing the disclosures, but are making it easier for companies to comply with the disclosures. There's a comment period that closes on the 27th of June 2025. They'll consider those comments and then publish the final amended IFRS or amendments to IFRS S2. From an Australian perspective, we are really keen to see this finalized and published globally, but also in Australia before 31 December 2025, when our organizations have to comply with AASB S2. Because there's some good things in here that we would like those clients to be able to use, and we're hoping that will happen. The timelines seem to suggest that it will be in place. And even if it's not mandatory effective, these amendments by 31 December, they've already indicated they will allow early application or early adoption. So what are the proposed amendments? So first of all, they're proposing to provide relief for measuring and disclosing Scope 3, Category 15, greenhouse gas emissions associated with derivatives and some financial activities. So this is particularly important for organizations that have significant Category 15 emissions. So Category 15 is looking at investments. So that's investments in other entities. It's loans that you provide financial institutions. So they've made some slight changes. And at this stage, not looking at derivatives and some other specialized financial activities. So that's some good news. They also, in the second item, provide some relief from the use of global industry classification standards, especially when you disclose your disaggregated financed emissions information. And again, that's related to Category 15. This is not a big issue for us in Australia, this number 2, because in AASB S2, we have that one change from the global standard where we don't have this focus on industry metrics. Then on the third one, clarification on the jurisdictional relief to use a measurement method other than the greenhouse gas protocol for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is important for us in Australia because in Australia, we have the the ENGA scheme for Scope 1 and 2, and then obviously for all of compliance with AASB S2, we have to look at the greenhouse gas protocol. So there's this interaction between the ENGA scheme for Scope 1 and 2, as well as the greenhouse gas protocol, and they're trying to clarify how that interaction would work. And this is the amendment that we're really keen to get into Australia, to say even if you have jurisdictional requirements for a part of your carbon footprint, so in our case, only a part, only Scope 1 and 2, you can still use this relief, because a lot of people have been worried. It's not as if we can use jurisdictional requirements for the whole carbon footprint, because we only have jurisdictional requirements for Scope 1 and 2. So can we still apply this relief? So they are including a clarification that you can use the relief for the parts that you have something, but then you have to top it up and you have to add additional greenhouse gas reporting on top of that. So this is an important requirement for us. The fourth one is also very important, and that is a permission to use jurisdiction-required global warming potential values that are not from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Again, this is important for us, because when we look at the NGR and the National Greenhouse Gas Accounts, it's often based on the IPCC report number 5, and it's not been updated to IPCC number 6 yet. And therefore, if we have to comply with AASB 2, and we have to comply specifically with IPCC 6, we might have to completely redo Scope 1 and 2 in Australia, because we have to use different global warming potentials. So they're now going to say, hang on, if in your jurisdiction under ENGA you are allowed to use the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Report 5 and those global warming potentials, you can do that and you will still be in compliance with AASB S2. So you can see there's some really important amendments coming through. So, we're very excited about this, and, we are pushing really hard and requesting that this be available by 31 December this year. So some of the next steps that they've explained, so there will be they'll get feedback, they'll consider the feedback, they aim to finalize it by the end of 2025, subject to stakeholder feedback, hoping stakeholders like it. I'm hoping. And then obviously in Australia, important that we also have it ready here. So really important for us to look at this. If you've got any questions or comments, BDO will be preparing a comment letter globally, but also in Australia. If there's something that you would like us to include, please email me. Please reach out to me. So that's the latest developments, just happened 2 days ago. Then an overview of AASB S2. So let's come back to AASB S2 and our journey. When we look at the objective of AASB S2, it's all about disclosing information about climate-related risks and opportunities that is useful to primary users, so that's investors, financiers, of general purpose financial reports in making decisions around allocating resources to the entity. So I've tried to highlight some key aspects. Then AASB S2 requires an entity to disclose information about climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect an entity's their cash flows, their access to financing, their cost of capital, over the short, medium, or long term. So we don't take a narrow view just over short term. It's short, medium, or long term. So you can see a big emphasis, climate-related risks and opportunities. And then in particular, when we look at the scope, climate-related risks, and they say it's not just physical risk, it's also transition risks. But it's not just risks, it's risks and opportunities. And then climate risk that could not reasonably expected to affect the business or the prospects is outside the scope. Now, as you know, the TCFD, which was the previous document or body on which AASB S2 has been built, the TCFD has a beautiful diagram where they link these climate-related risks, opportunities, and ultimately financial impact. Remember, where we want to get here is financial impact. We've got investors and financiers looking at this mandatory sustainability report. They're reading about what are your risks, what are your opportunities. Good reading. However, bring it home and show us the financial impact. So we've got the financial report, sustainability report sitting next to each other, but now integrate the impact of the disclosures in your sustainability report on the numbers in the financial report, the numbers on your income statement, your profit and loss, on your cash flow, on your balance sheet. I just absolutely love this diagram. If we go back to those TCFD recommendations, which was the start of all of this, they've got the 4 pillars. And if you look at that strategy pillar, which we'll be disclosing over 2 months, they said at a high level, disclose actual and potential impacts of climate-related risk and opportunities on the company's business, strategy, and financial planning, where such information is material. And then they had 3 recommended disclosures that sat below that. So they said at a high level, describe climate-related risk and opportunities that the company has identified over the short, medium, and long term. So you can see, aligned with AASB S2. Secondly, describe the impact. So it's not just these are the risks and opportunities. What's the impact of these risks and opportunities on the business, on strategy, on financial planning? And then lastly, describe the resilience of the company's strategy, taking into account the different climate-related scenarios, including a 2.5 degree or lower scenario. Now, in Australia, we've got specific requirements around scenarios. We've got 2 mandated scenarios, but TCFD years ago came up with these are the high-level disclosures. If we then move on to AASB S2, last month we talked about governance and governance disclosures and what you need to put in place. Today we focus on strategy and the pillar as articulated in AASB S2. So they've said, let's build on TCFD, and now we want climate-related risks and opportunities, physical risk, transition risk, and very specific disclosures around that. And we'll look at that over the 2 months. We want to know about the climate resilience of your strategy and your business model. And separately, high level, we want effects on financial statements. So bring it home. It's not just these are the risks, these are the opportunities, this is how resilient you are, this is how we deal with it. What is the potential effect on financial statements? So if we look at the importance of strategy, the TCFD over the years have done research and they've published TCFD status reports globally. So it's great information to consider. And one of the things they say in one of their workshops, they said, disclosing in line with the strategy recommendation or the strategy pillar provides information to investors and other users to better assess the potential future performance of the company. Now, this is an interesting one. When we look at financial statements, financial reports, you're taking a historical view of what's happened, transactions that happened, and you look at the financial position at reporting date. And you look at the result, actual results for the year, actual cash flows for the year. But when we start to look at this mandatory sustainability report and when we look at this strategy column, we're starting to give investors and users some information on what a potential future could look like for this company. Right, so valuable information to these primary users of financial statements if we look at AASB S2 words. Now, the research they've done is they've asked users Of all these recommendations, which would you find most useful? And you'll see at the bottom I've said there, these findings are based on a survey in which users were asked to rate the usefulness of specific disclosure elements. If you look at the 11 recommendations that the TCFD have. Now, what's interesting here, when they looked at ranking the top 10, 3 strategy disclosures are in the top 6. So the top useful information is how climate-related issues have affected business and strategy. Most useful information. The third one, the material climate-related issues that's been identified for each sector and geography. Right? And then the third one, which came in, is number 6, the material climate-related issues that's been identified. So you can see strategy has rated very high in what investors and users value when they look at the TCFD recommendations. And we expect something very similar if you look at the disclosures from AASB S2. So if we look at an overview of the AASB S2 Pillar 2, the strategy pillar, it's important to stand back and say, what is the objective of the disclosures in this pillar? And the objective of these climate-related financial disclosures on strategy is to enable the users of general purpose financial reports to, number 1, understand an entity's strategy for managing climate-related risks and opportunities. So it's not just here are our risks that we've identified, here are our opportunities. How, what is our strategy to deal with these risks and to deal with these opportunities? So we want people to understand our strategy for managing climate-related risks and opportunities. If you look at a breakdown of the disclosures under Pillar 2, there are 5 key parts to it. The first part, if I start on the left-hand side, they talk about climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably expected to affect the entity's prospects. Right? So that's what are the climate and risk and opportunities? Let's identify them, basically. Then you move on to the next block where we say, okay, now that we have the risks and opportunities, what are the current and the anticipated effects of these risks and opportunities on our business model and our value chain? So these are the risks. What are the anticipated effects? Then in the third category or the third block, what are the effects of these risks and opportunities on our strategy, on our decision making, on our transition plan? So if you look at it again, on the left-hand side, we identify it. Then we consider anticipated effects. And now that we know what the anticipated effects are in the third block, what are we going to do about it? What's our strategy? What's our mitigation plan or our transition plan? Then in the fourth block, this is making it very real and bringing it back to financial impact, the effects of these climate-related and risks and opportunities on our financial position, our balance sheet, our financial performance, our profit and loss, our cash flows in a cash flow statement, their anticipated effects over the short, the medium and long term, not just the short term, short, medium, long term. And also, how does all of this factor into our planning? And then finally, disclosures around the resilience of our strategy, our business model to deal with all of the uncertainties around climate-related risk and opportunities. So you can see Pillar 2 have 5 distinct parts to it. They capture all of this in one paragraph, and then there's further explanation across paragraphs 10 to 22, and I've tried to link them here for you. Now, all of these disclosures are you have to do it in order. You have to start on the left-hand side by identifying risks, then considering the effects, then considering the impact on your strategy, then modeling the impact on financial statements, and considering your resilience as a result of the modeling. So looking at all of that, we keep on coming back to climate-related risks and opportunities, and all these disclosures around climate-related risks and opportunities. So to me, when I was preparing and thinking about it again over the last few days in anticipation of this webinar, I think it's important for us to say, as accountants, as CFOs, as board members, as sustainability people that are now pulling all of these disclosures together in compliance with AASB S2. It's not just getting our head around AASB S2 and what we have to disclose. There's a lot more to learn. We have to understand what is climate change, because unless we understand a little bit of what climate change is, it would be impossible to identify the risks and opportunities that climate change would create for your business. So I thought, before I look at the disclosures, maybe we take a bit of a step back and say, what is climate change? How does it lead to risks and opportunities for your business? And then how do we disclose it and comply with AASB S2? So it's a bit of a journey. Please bear with me. Now, as always, whenever I've got extracts, because I do believe to go to the original source information, I would put in references and links on where you can find it. Now, this definition of climate change comes from the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC, and I got it from the glossary that goes with report number 6, the latest report. And I've highlighted some aspects here that I think is really important to provide context for what we're doing. First of all, they start by saying climate change refers to a change in the state of the climate that can be identified by changes in the mean and or variability of its properties, and that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. And the next part is incredibly important. Climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings, such as modulations of the solar systems, volcanic eruptions, and persistent changes in the composition of the atmosphere or in land use. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the Framework Convention on Climate Change of the United Nations, it defines climate change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. And that human activity alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and it's in addition to natural climate variability. So really in green I've marked there, they are saying there's a distinction between climate change attributable to human activities and then climate change or climate variability attributable to natural causes. And I think that's important. A part of climate change we can attribute to natural causes. And let's not argue against that. We get that. But there's also a part of climate change that can be linked to human activities, and in particular burning of fossil fuels as an example. So we're back to climate change. There's natural things, natural causes, and there's human causes. We cannot change natural causes, but the climate risk and opportunities, we are trying to link it at also these human activities. In order to assess climate-related risks and opportunities, and this is what we have to do, that's the starting point of all of these disclosures, I further think it's important to understand that these risks and opportunities exist as a result of a combination of things. There's the climate science part of it, and very importantly, there's the climate policy part of it. because the climate science and climate change and what it does to the environment, that's one thing. And often that would result in physical type risks, right? Let's say increases in heat or extreme heat or floods, etc. So there's a climate science piece, clearly. But because the world or many countries and very many governments have decided to try and deal with climate change, mitigate climate change, limit the increases of global warming to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, we now have climate policies across the world. And these climate policies in particular therefore requires businesses to transition to a lower carbon economy that's less harmful to the environment. So the climate policies that is being put in place to try and limit climate change, that results in transition risks. There's a transition from just what we do normally to this lower carbon economy, this lower temperature, and all of those policies collectively results in transition risks and opportunities. So we cannot look just at the climate science or just look at climate policy. There's an interaction between the two, which is very important to at least understand at a high level. So I thought maybe we should unpack a little bit on climate science. Now, obviously, we cannot become experts in a few minutes on climate science, and I don't think finance teams, board members have to be experts on this, but they do have to have some understanding to help them to identify climate-related risk and opportunities. And not just that, you have to identify, you have to consider the impact or the effects, the impacts, you have to model it. And unless we have some understanding here, it would be really hard to do that. Now, the intergovernmental, sorry, I just want to close these. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change is a United Nations body for assessing science related to climate change. And it was specifically created to provide policymakers with scientific assessments on climate change. So it's really important that when we look at the climate science, we look at scientific evidence and assessment. So IPCC and AASB S2 specifically refer to IPCC, refers to the latest report number 6. And as I said earlier, there's proposals that we might be able to still refer to a previous version, report 5 around global warming potential in certain situations. So this has been recognized by the International Sustainability Standards Board, by the AASB, as the body that gives us the best information on the science around climate change. And there's a number of reports, and I'll give you a bit of I just did a screen grab. If you look at in the middle, that 6 assessment report, there's a bit of a summary report. There's a report on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability. There's a report on mitigation of climate change. There's the physical science basis. There's a lot of information included in that assessment report. It's not just one report. It's got different parts to it. And every time I read through these reports, there's something else that grabs my attention. Fantastic information. Even just to read, to get the necessary background to identify climate-related risks and opportunities. But then you'll see they also have special and methodology reports. So they've got reports on a special report on climate change and cities. They've got a report on climate change and land, just as a few examples. So amazing information available to you. So this is a fantastic report that we use a lot. Climate Change 2023, the latest report, the report 6. And this is a bit of a synthesis report. So it's a fantastic information. So for example, out of that report, we've got some regional fact sheet about Australasia. And these are some common regional changes that we could expect, that we should therefore take into account. Australian land and land areas have warmed by around 1.4 degrees, and New Zealand 1.1 degrees between 1910 and 2020. And there's a lot of information here. Heat extremes have increased. Relative sea levels have risen. Show cover and depth have decreased, which is bad for those who like skiing, etc. But there's some regional facts sheets that Australian businesses could apply. They also have some really interesting projections on what Australia could look like at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 4 degrees of global warming. Again, interesting information. They've actually, for Australia, broken it down even further. You've got information on Northern Australia, Central Australia, Southern Australia, and Eastern Australia, and obviously New Zealand. Information that businesses should consider. And if you look at the climate science, and again, if you look at this report, 2024 was the hottest year on record, with an increase of 1.55 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Remember that target of 1.5 degrees is an average over 100 years, so it's not as if it's all lost, but it's getting harder. We have to action. And we've seen increasing impacts on water availability, food production, health and well-being, cities, settlements, infrastructures, and there's certain sectors more impacted. If you look at the climate science, again, if you look at those future scenarios, what the world could look like, and they break it down for what Australia could look like, as I've shown earlier, that 1.5 degrees target is looking really unlikely. A 2 degrees target seems hard to meet. And we're already seeing, and they're expecting, an increase in the severity and the frequency of extreme weather events, so heat waves, droughts, floods, etc. And there are also long-term changes. So that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What we also use in Australia, we're very lucky that we've got the CSIRO that does scientific research that they make available. So if you look at the state of climate in 2024, which has been published even more recently than the recent IPCC report, they have a biannual state of climate report that looks at the latest national and international climate research, monitoring science and projection information to describe changes, long-term trends for Australia. Right, so the CSIRO, powerful information for our own country to consider. If you look at the CSIRO, I've got a link to that report on the left-hand side, but here are some key points from that report. Again, they give an overview of how Australia has warmed, the sea surface temperatures. We've got increased frequency of extreme heat. Heavy short-term rainfall events are becoming more intense. There's been an increase in rainfall and stream flow across parts of northern Australia, increase in extreme fire weather, a longer fire season across large parts of the country, etc. So again, powerful information based on research. So I think as an absolute minimum, if you want to consider climate science for your business, to have a good read of the summary report of IPCC, Report 6, and the CSI report is fantastic. Really informs your thinking. But that's just the climate science. Remember I said there's a second part, and that is the climate policy. Now, if you look at climate policy, this is very high level. Some of the policies we've seen since 2015. And here you can see that there's been the Paris Agreements in 2015, which is an international treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to limit global temperature increases to well below 2 degrees. And then the European Union and 194 countries have joined that Paris Agreement. And it requires countries to report emissions and targets It's referred to as your national determined contributions every 5 years. And also it established a technology framework to support technology development and transfers to improve resilience. There's also then in 2021 the Global Methane Pledge to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. And it was launched by the EU and the United States and currently signed by 155 countries. Significant, the methane pledge, one of the 7 greenhouse gases. We also have the UAE consensus, which was signed in 2023, and it was a response to the first global stocktake that was done after the Paris Agreement. They said we know we need a deep, rapid, sustained reductions. And then also we have to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems if we want to achieve net zero by 2050. So we now have a focus in 2021 on methane. In the UAE consensus called out fossil fuels and moving away from that. And then the Loss and Damage Fund established in 2023, it's a fund established to assist developing countries, particularly vulnerable to changes in climate change, to assist them. So you can see from a climate policy perspective, globally, a lot of things happening. Interesting, if we look at current policies in place, and that's that red line, implemented policies, we're not going to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. It's going to be really hard. If we want to reach 1.5 degrees, or if we want to reach 2 degrees, we will need a lot more policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So existing policies are not going to get us close. And therefore, at the implemented policies result in projected emissions that lead to warming of 3.2 degrees. With a range between 2.2 and 3.5, medium confidence. So that's the projections. It is a lot more than 1.5 and 2 degrees. And what are the consequences of that? If we look at implemented policies, and if we're heading to 2.2 or 2.5 degrees, what does that mean for your business? So important to understand this background. So how does an entity identify and assess climate-related risks and opportunities? What's the process? I think when I speak to clients, a lot of people would say, Aletta, what are the disclosures? Give me a disclosure checklist. Give me a model report. That's not the most important thing we should be doing now. Yes, it's good to know what you ultimately have to disclose, but we're well beyond that. In order to do those disclosures, there are things that we have to do now, today. We have to identify and assess climate-related risks and opportunities, and then we have to consider these anticipated effects, then we have to do modeling. There's a lot of work, and at the end of that process, we'll hopefully, I'm very confident, we'll have the information that we can disclose and comply with AASB S2. So the key thing to focus on, and this is the starting part of this whole process, is you have to conduct a climate risk and opportunity assessment to kickstart compliance with AASB S2. And if you've not documented this assessment and the process that you've gone through, not documented, not done, how are you going to be assurance ready? And then this is our assessment methodology that we follow. And we document every step along the way so that the auditors can come in and say, okay, we've done this research and here we've got a report that considers inherent risk, likely, the likelihood, the impact. We've looked at short-term, medium-term, long-term, however we've defined it. Those are not cast in stone. And so here's the initial report. Then in step 2, we've discussed it with the leadership team at the client, and they've made changes. They've provided feedback based on their understanding, but it's a robust process. Then we assessed controls, and those controls will therefore reduce your initial risk assessment, and you'll come up with residual risks. And then when we look at initial risks, controls, residual risks, we then put that in a risk register. And if there's residual risk that we're not happy to accept, but we have to manage, what do we do about it? What additional controls do we need? And how does it feed into a normal risk management process? And who reviews it, who reports on it? And then we have a final report. So all of this, we need evidence so we can show to the auditors we didn't grab these risks out of the air, or we didn't say we don't have risks without being really informed. Not looking at CSIRO, not looking at the IPCC report. The other point that I want to make is a lot of people have some confusion around, we want to do financial modeling. There's a process here. You have to start with climate risk assessment, climate risk and opportunity assessment. That's step one. That then informs your scenarios and how you draft your scenarios, so your what if scenarios. And as you draft the scenarios, it's iterative. Yes, it could impact again your risk assessment, but it's first a proper risk assessment with residual risk, which informs scenario analysis, which then inform your financial modeling of the impact. So there's a sequence here that you have to follow. And these, if you follow these and you document it along the way, will result in the disclosures that meet the requirements of AASB S2. So if you look at your climate-related risks, so we've gone through the science, we've gone through the policies, we've gone through the process we have to go through. What are these climate-related risks that we're looking for? So we're looking for physical risks. So climatic events, chronic issues such as water security, natural disasters, increased exposure to hazards. Yes, we're looking at physical risks. Why are we looking at that? Because those risks could have a direct impact on the value of assets. It could damage your assets or your property. It could lead to lower asset values. It could lead to increased insurance claims. It could lead to supply chain disruption, and that will impact your revenue and would impact your costs. And we've seen supply chain disruption during COVID, a huge risk. So physical risk could impact this, and therefore we have to consider, do we have physical risk and how would it impact us, our business? But transition risk is how do we transition from the current trajectory around global warming to a low carbon economy that would lead to a lower global warming. So all these policies that we expect to see, and even those already in place, how does that impact us? You know, what did it mean for us that we have to comply with AASB S2? What did it mean for us that we have to measure our greenhouse gas emissions? What does the safeguard mechanism mean for large emitters? So transition risk is looking at policy changes, technological innovation, social adaptation that could disrupt, and it could lead to disruptions as we adjust to this low emissions economy. Now, it could impact pricing of your goods. It could impact demand for your goods. It could result in stranded assets. It could result in defaults on loans if you're a financial services organization. So how do these physical and transition risks impact your business? And have an assessment. So this is just a visual representation. If you look at climate-related risk, we've got physical risks, which could be acute, which is event-driven, or chronic, longer-term changes. And if you look at transition risks, all those policy and legal risks technology risks, how changes in technology, improvements in technology, how innovation will impact your business. Market risks, and then also reputation, incredibly important. How does reputation risk impact consumer and community perceptions? Um, I like this again from the TCFD. If you look at some examples around all these risks that I've explained on the previous slide, they provide examples of risks and opportunities. So policy and legal, look at reputation. If there's a shift in consumer preference, if there's increased stakeholder concern or negative feedback, if there's a stigmatization of your sector, that is terrible for your reputation. If you look at the market, there's changing market behavior. There's uncertainty in market signals. There's increased cost of raw materials. So there's a lot of transitional risks that we have to consider in moving to a lower carbon economy. These are just alternative sources to give you ideas to broaden your thinking on what could be transition risks or physical risk. And again, we all have to pull it back to financial impact. Now, I'm looking at the clock and I have 8 minutes left. I have discussed this in the past, and I wish I had time to look at it again, but I've included it again. Just more and more examples around climate-related risks, and then next to it, in the red column, potential financial impacts. I think this is from the TCFD again. They're trying to give us examples of a risk and say, don't look at the risk and say it doesn't impact me. Have you consider what the potential financial impact can be, and tick through this to get your mind going. So there's policy and legal risks. This is transition risks, technology risks, market risks, reputation risks. The AASB, when they issued IFRS S2, did provide some examples. I think there's only 2. TCFD have a lot of examples, a lot of guidance materials, which is perfectly acceptable to use. But IFRS S2, there's some examples that you can look at. Example 1 and example 3 are risks. Example 2 is an opportunity. Again, if you look at opportunities, we're not discounting the fact that the flip side of the coin is you could have risks on the one side and an opportunity on the other side. So let's think about, are there opportunities for our business? So it's not just risks, it's also opportunities. And if you look at these opportunities, energy sources, maybe we could use lower emission sources of energy. Maybe we could use new technologies. Maybe we can participate in a carbon market. So there are opportunities. And again, how do those opportunities impact your financials? And TCFD have gone through examples which are very useful, and also the ISB has an example. I want to use the last 5-6 minutes to pull it together in a disclosure, because I want to try and prove to you that looking at the climate science, looking at the climate policies, doing a proper risk assessment will actually help you to meet the disclosure requirements of AASB S2. Actually, without a proper risk assessment, scenario analysis, financial modeling, you cannot meet the requirements of AASB S2. So the principle when we look at disclosures in this strategy pillar, and in the strategy pillar, there's this big focus starting point, risks and opportunities. The whole principle here is you have to identify climate-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect an entity's prospects, and the entity shall, now, as always, shall is a red word. I have to do this. I've got no option. An entity shall use all reasonable and supportable information that is available to the entity at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So today I have provided you a reference to IPCC reports and the CSIRO reports. Those are available free of charge, fantastic information on the website. So without undue cost or effort, you can refer to this, and therefore you are forced to refer to that. It's reasonable, it's supportable, it's scientific, recognized bodies, undue cost and effort. And you should also look at information about past events, current conditions, and forecast of future conditions. Now let's look at these disclosures around strategy. Now the very first one, an entity shall disclose information that enables the users of these general purpose reports to understand the climate-related risk and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the prospects. So it's enough information that they can understand these risks and opportunities and how they relate to your business. I also wanted to call out that, remember, in our very first year, not everything in AASB S2 is subject to assurance, but this requirement is subject to assurance in year one. So they have to be able to understand these risks and opportunities. So a methodology documented. They go further, the second disclosure, an entity shall describe these climate risk and opportunities. So it's not just here's a list of climate risk and opportunities that impact us. You have to describe them so they can understand it. Again, subject to assurance. The third one, an entity shall explain. So it's not just describe. It's not here it is, here's a definition of it. That's not good enough. Explain for each of these risks and opportunities that you've identified, whether the entity considers this risk to be a physical risk or a transition risk. So explain how you got to that conclusion, subject to assurance. Then, and you can see these are not subject to assurance, but you have to disclose it. An entity shall specify for each climate-related risk and opportunity that you've identified, over which time horizon, short, medium, or long term, the effects of this risk and opportunity could reasonably be expected to occur. So you have to say, is it short term, medium term, long term? Specify that. It's part of our process. We also have to explain, how did you define short term, medium term, long term? Could be different for different businesses. So how did you define it? And therefore, where did the risks end up? And how do these definitions link to your planning horizons used in your strategic decision making? So I've looked at only 5 disclosures in AASB S2, but these 5 disclosures and what you need to do to generate these disclosures, the whole process around the climate risk and opportunity assessment, is the starting point. It is critical. It's super important. It's subject to assurance. It has to be well documented. So next month, we'll go on and we'll look at the rest of the strategy pillar. And if you need any help, please reach out to me. We are happy to help you, to guide you. This is incredibly important, and that we get this right. So how can BDO help? Yes, we do carbon accounting, but we also do sustainability reporting, whether it's mandatory or voluntary. Mandatory, AASB S2, that's what we do. We can help you with strategy, or consulting, decarbonization, and also our auditors provide assurance. So these are the people that you can contact to help you with AASB S2, especially that middle column, sustainability reporting. Please feel free to reach out to us, and these are our assurance partners. We've got our newsletters, and please link with me on LinkedIn. I try and share information as fast as I can, to keep everybody informed, and please reach out if we can help you in any way. I don't know how I've managed this. It's exactly 12 o'clock, so we've done it in an hour. Thank you very much for joining me, as always, on this very exciting journey to get ready for compliance with AASB S2. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you.